The courthouse stood like a quiet sentinel on the edge of the small Midwestern town, its brick facade softened by the golden light of a late morning sun. Inside, the air carried that unmistakable mixture of polished wood, faintly musty paper, and the distant hum of fluorescent lights. It was a place where people entered carrying the heavy weight of decisions, and where silence often spoke louder than words. Courtroom B, tucked on the second floor, was no different. Rows of wooden benches stretched neatly in parallel lines, the glossy surfaces reflecting thin strips of light from the tall windows along one wall. A hush settled over the room as a handful of spectators filed in, their voices dropping to murmurs out of instinctive respect for the gravity of the space. The faint creak of shoes on the old hardwood floor punctuated the otherwise still morning. Near the back of the room, a young mother sat with her child nestled against her side. Her name was Rachel Moore, a woman in her late 20s with tired eyes and a nervous energy that betrayed her outward calm. She adjusted the collar of her pale blue cardigan, smoothing invisible wrinkles while keeping one protective arm wrapped around her son. 3-year-old Caleb, dressed in a plaid shirt and dark jeans, swung his little legs restlessly, his curious eyes darting from one unfamiliar sight to another. For Rachel, this wasn't just another morning. The custody hearing ahead would determine how often Caleb's father could visit and what their future routine might look like. The thought of strangers making decisions about her child's life weighed heavily on her chest. She kept her voice low and her posture steady, determined not to reveal the storm of emotions that churned beneath the surface. Caleb, however, was far from subdued. The boy's round cheeks flushed with excitement as he surveyed the room. The polished benches, the stern-looking flags standing beside the judge's bench, and the dark wooden rail that separated the audience from the central floor were all part of a new, intriguing world. He squirmed slightly, tugging at the sleeve of his mother's sweater, but Rachel gently patted his small hand in reassurance. At the far right corner of the room, a presence caught Caleb's attention. Sitting upright beside a uniformed officer was a large, sleek German shepherd with alert amber eyes. The dog's posture was regal, its ears perked forward as if listening to every sound in the courtroom. A polished badge glinted faintly from the officer's chest, but it was the dog that held the child's fascination. Officer Daniel Harper, the K-9's handler, stood with an air of practiced calm. Dressed in a dark blue uniform, he exuded the quiet authority of someone accustomed to tense environments. His partner, a 4-year-old K-9 named Rex, was trained for scent detection and security work. Harper kept a steady hand on the dog's harness, but Rex required little restraint. The German shepherd sat perfectly still, his gaze sweeping the room in measured, silent observation. Caleb tilted his head, transfixed. He had seen dogs in picture books and on walks through the neighborhood, but nothing like this. This wasn't a playful puppy tugging at a leash or wagging its tail wildly in greeting. This was a dog with purpose, a creature that seemed to carry a secret understanding of the world around it. Rachel followed her son's gaze and caught sight of the K-9. A small flicker of unease rippled through her. She had heard of police dogs being present during high-profile trials, but this was a simple custody case. Why was a K-9 team assigned here? Her mind spun briefly through possibilities. Was there a safety concern? A previous incident? She pulled Caleb a little closer, though her son hardly noticed. "Mommy, doggy," Caleb whispered, his voice carrying just enough to earn a few curious glances from nearby spectators. His eyes sparkled, and a small smile broke across his face. Rachel pressed a finger gently to her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. "Yes, sweetheart," she said softly, leaning down so her words were meant only for him. "But we have to use our quiet voices here." Caleb nodded, though his attention remained locked on the German shepherd. Rex, seemingly aware of the little boy's interest, flicked one ear and shifted his gaze. For the briefest moment, Child and dog regarded each other across the quiet courtroom, one full of innocent curiosity, the other trained to detect danger with instincts honed by years of discipline. The judge's bench remained empty for now, but the bailiff moved purposefully about the room, setting papers in place and checking the clock on the far wall. Attorneys on either side of the aisle whispered final notes to their clients, the shuffle of papers breaking the otherwise soft atmosphere. The hearing was scheduled to begin in just a few minutes. Officer Harper stood silently, his eyes scanning the benches and doors with professional precision. To him, this was routine, a precautionary assignment. But even he couldn't ignore the quiet amusement of watching Rex interact with the little boy across the room. He knew his partner well enough to recognize the subtle shift in posture, the slight softening of the dog's gaze. Rex wasn't alerting to danger. He was curious. Meanwhile, Caleb's small hand slipped free of his mother's grasp and pointed toward the dog, a movement so natural and sudden that Rachel barely had time to react. His tiny index finger stretched confidently, and in a voice clear enough to break through the low murmur of conversation, he exclaimed, "Doggy!" The sound echoed in the chamber like the ringing of a small bell. Heads turned almost instantly. A few spectators smiled faintly at the innocent outburst, while others merely raised their brows, their attention drawn from legal documents and whispered strategies to the sight of a toddler captivated by a working police dog. Rachel's cheeks warmed as she gently lowered Caleb's arm. "Caleb," she whispered firmly, though her tone carried more nervousness than anger. "Remember your inside voice." But it was too late to fully contain the moment. Even the bailiff paused mid-step, his eyes flicking toward the source of the cheerful announcement. Officer Harper glanced down at Rex, whose ears twitched in subtle acknowledgement. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, as though the child's call had been a private invitation. For a heartbeat, the room seemed to pause. The shuffle of papers stilled, the whispers quieted, and the creak of the benches faded into a curious silence. In that instant, it was as if everyone from the anxious mother to the seasoned officer was waiting to see what would happen next. Rachel's heart skipped. She tightened her grip on Caleb, who now leaned forward on the bench, his eyes wide with unfiltered joy. She could feel the tension in the room shifting, though she couldn't quite place why. This was supposed to be a simple procedural morning, a hearing that would last no more than an hour. And yet, with her son's innocent gesture, something about the atmosphere felt unexpectedly charged. The German shepherd remained perfectly still for a few seconds more, his steady gaze locked with the child's. Then, to the quiet amazement of those watching, Rex shifted slightly on his paws. It was a movement so subtle, just the faintest forward lean that only those paying close attention noticed. But for Officer Harper, it was enough to signal that his partner's instincts had been stirred. A soft ripple of energy seemed to pass through the room as Harper's hand tightened on the harness. He didn't give a command. He didn't need to. Years of working alongside Rex had taught him to read every nuance of the dog's behavior. Something about the boy, or perhaps something around him, had captured the K-9's attention in a way that went beyond mere curiosity. Rachel, unaware of the officer's trained observations, simply held her son close. She could feel his small heart beating quickly beneath his shirt, a rhythm of excitement rather than fear. Caleb's face glowed with innocent delight, his smile unwavering as he whispered again, almost to himself, "Doggy." The judge had yet to enter, and the hearing had not officially begun, but already the morning had taken on a life of its own. What should have been a routine start to a legal proceeding now carried a sense of quiet anticipation, like the first gust of wind before an approaching storm. None of those present, neither the weary mother, nor the seasoned officer, nor the restless spectators, could know that this simple, childlike moment would soon lead to something far more dramatic. And yet, as Caleb's small finger lingered in the air, Pointing toward the watchful K-9, the course of the day had already begun to shift. The bailiff had just finished placing a stack of neatly bound documents on the judge's bench when Caleb's small, high-pitched voice rang out again, brighter and clearer than before. "Doggy," he exclaimed, this time with the determined delight of a child who was certain he had discovered something truly extraordinary. His tiny finger remained stretched forward like an arrow, pointing directly at the German shepherd seated near the courtroom's side wall. The sound, though innocent, sliced through the subdued courtroom air like a pebble skipping across still water. The low murmur of attorneys consulting with their clients faltered. Papers rustled and stilled. Even the squeak of the bailiff's shoes on the polished wood came to an abrupt halt. All eyes followed the small boy's gesture until they landed on the animal whose presence had already carried an understated gravity. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Heat crept up her neck as she gave Caleb's arm a gentle but firm tug, attempting to lower his hand. "Caleb," she whispered, her voice urgent yet hushed. Inside voice, "Sweetheart." But the 3-year-old remained transfixed, his eyes wide and shimmering with the wonder only a toddler could possess. His arm, despite his mother's coaxing, wavered only slightly. It was as though an invisible string pulled his attention toward the K-9, a magnetic connection that neither Rachel nor anyone else could sever. Across the room, Officer Daniel Harper felt the faintest tug of tension travel down the leather leash that linked him to his partner. Years of experience taught him to recognize even the most subtle shifts in Rex's posture, a change in breathing, a flick of the ear, a slight forward lean. The German shepherd's body had stiffened, not with aggression, but with heightened focus. The officer's trained eyes narrowed slightly. Rex's ears pricked forward, his amber gaze fixed on the small boy perched halfway down the second row of benches. The dog's tail remained low, but twitched once, the tip brushing the polished floor like a silent metronome. To anyone untrained, the movements might have seemed like nothing more than a friendly animal responding to a child's attention. But Harper knew better. The handler kept his stance neutral, his hand resting lightly on the harness. He gave no command. Years of partnership had taught him that forcing Rex's attention elsewhere would be futile when the dog's instincts were engaged. Instead, Harper observed his eyes moving from Rex to the boy, then to the people surrounding them. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The quiet was almost theatrical, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. A faint metallic hum from the overhead lights became suddenly noticeable in the silence. Someone in the back cleared their throat, a sound sharp against the soft tension that had settled over the room. Rachel felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her and her son. She shifted uncomfortably, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "He just loves dogs," she offered in a low voice meant for no one in particular, though her explanation earned only a few polite smiles and curious glances. Caleb, oblivious to the quiet spectacle he had created, leaned forward on the bench until his small sneakers barely clung to the wooden seat. His eyes sparkled with excitement, his tiny lips parting as though he might call out again. "Doggy," he whispered this time, softer but still audible in the courtroom's charged silence. Rex tilted his head, the motion slow and deliberate. His gaze never wavered. A faint gleam caught in his amber eyes as the morning light streamed through the tall windows. To Caleb, it was as though the dog were listening, really listening to his small, eager voice. Officer Harper allowed himself the faintest smile. He knew Rex well enough to sense when his partner was simply curious. But there was something else, an undercurrent of alertness that Harper couldn't quite dismiss. The dog wasn't showing signs of distress or aggression, but his focus was unwavering, his body slightly angled as though ready to move. In the second row, Rachel's heart beat a quick, uneven rhythm. She tightened her arm around Caleb, feeling the warmth of his small frame against her side. A flicker of unease passed through her, though she couldn't say why. There was no threat here, no reason for fear. And yet, the dog's silent tension sent a shiver down her spine. The bailiff, a stout man with a clipped gray mustache, stepped forward cautiously, his voice breaking the tension. "Everything all right here?" he asked, directing the question toward Officer Harper. Harper offered a professional nod. "All good," he replied evenly, though his eyes remained on Rex. "Just attentive." The bailiff gave a small grunt of acknowledgement and turned back toward the bench, but the subtle unease lingered. Caleb giggled softly, the sound light and disarming. He clapped his small hands together once, a soft pat-pat echoing in the hushed room. "Doggy likes me," he announced proudly, though the words carried only as far as his mother and the officer who stood across the aisle. Rachel pressed her lips together to suppress a nervous laugh. "Maybe," she said quietly, brushing her hand over his hair. "But we still have to be quiet." Despite her words, the moment felt far from ordinary. Something in the boy's innocent declaration seemed to resonate through the space, tugging at the edges of everyone's attention. Rex adjusted his stance. The movement was slight, a slow shift of weight from one paw to another, but it drew Harper's full focus. The officer's fingers tightened subtly on the harness strap. This wasn't a playful shuffle. This was intent. The German shepherd lowered his head just a fraction, nostrils flaring almost imperceptibly. Harper knew the signs. Rex was scenting the air. His training was precise. Narcotics, explosives, weapons, even subtle traces of certain chemicals. The dog's stillness belied the rapid calculations occurring in his finely tuned senses. Harper scanned the benches, his eyes tracing a slow path over each attendee. Nothing seemed out of place. No visible threats, no suspicious packages, or sudden movements. Yet Rex remained fixed, his attention anchored to the small boy in the plaid shirt. Rachel felt Caleb shift again, his small body leaning forward as though drawn by an invisible cord. Her instinctive grip tightened. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But Caleb's gaze never wavered. His world had narrowed to a single point, the dog with the golden eyes. Behind the bench, the door creaked softly. The bailiff straightened as the judge's arrival neared. A rustle of movement swept through the room, attorneys gathering papers, clients adjusting their seats. Yet even as the normal rhythm of court prepared to resume, the quiet tension between the child and the K-9 lingered like an undercurrent. Harper leaned slightly toward Rex, his voice a low murmur meant for the dog alone. "Easy, partner," he said softly. "We're just observing." Rex didn't move. His tail gave one slow, deliberate flick, and his ears twitched forward. The dog's breathing remained steady, but his eyes stayed locked on Caleb, unblinking, unreadable. The judge entered moments later, robes flowing softly as he approached the bench. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and commanding. The courtroom rose to its feet in unison, the creak of benches and shuffle of shoes breaking the fragile spell. Caleb stood with the others, his small hand still clutching his mother's. As the judge took his seat and the sound of the gavel echoed once, the boy's eyes darted immediately back to the corner where the German shepherd waited. The dog had not shifted. His gaze remained steady, his posture perfectly composed. Yet to those who had witnessed the quiet exchange, the air still carried a charge, a silent promise that something more lay beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary morning. Rachel exhaled slowly, trying to calm the quick flutter of her heart. She smoothed Caleb's hair and whispered, "Eyes on me now, sweetheart." The judge is talking, but Caleb barely heard her. His eyes were still fixed on Rex, the doggy, who seemed to be watching him just as intently. And in that locked gaze, child to K-9, something unspoken lingered, a spark of anticipation, that none of the adults could yet name, but all would soon feel. The hearing was about to begin, but for those who had witnessed the boy's innocent declaration and the dog's unwavering response, it was clear that the day's most unforgettable moment had already begun to unfold. The sharp crack of the judge's gavel brought everyone to their feet, yet the courtroom felt strangely off balance. The usual ritual papers rustling, benches creaking, voices lowering to respectful murmurs, played out as expected, but beneath the routine lingered a quiet hum of tension. Those who had witnessed the curious standoff between the little boy and the K-9 carried it with them like a question left unanswered. Judge Whitaker, a tall man with silver hair and a reputation for efficiency, swept into the room and settled behind the polished mahogany bench. His reading glasses dangled from a chain around his neck, and his eyes scanned the courtroom with the practiced sweep of someone used to reading not just faces, but atmospheres. Something about the room felt different. He could feel it even before he took his seat. "Good morning," he said, voice smooth but commanding. "Please be seated." The room obeyed as one, a synchronized shuffle of bodies and wood. Caleb plopped down next to his mother with a soft thud, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the bench. Rachel smoothed the wrinkles in her cardigan with one hand and tugged him closer with the other, her heart still skittering from the attention their small interaction had drawn. As the judge began his introductions, reciting the case number and explaining the purpose of the custody hearing, Caleb's attention remained elsewhere. His eyes darted past the rows of adults and fixed again on the corner of the courtroom, where the German shepherd sat like a living statue. Rex hadn't moved much since the judge entered. His posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, paws aligned neatly in front of him, but to a trained eye, the subtle signs of alertness were unmistakable. His ears were forward, his amber gaze fixed, and every few seconds, the muscles along his back tightened just slightly, as though readying for a command that had not yet been given. Officer Harper stood beside him, one hand resting casually on the harness, the other tucked behind his back. Outwardly, he was calm, but his mind was running quiet calculations. Rex wasn't signaling an alert, at least not yet. No pawing, no barking, no sudden lunge. But the stillness itself, so focused, so deliberate, told him his partner's instincts had picked up on something subtle. Harper let his eyes sweep the room again. Families sat stiffly in the gallery. Attorneys shuffled their notes. A court clerk tapped at a keyboard. Nothing out of place. Nothing dangerous. And yet, Rex continued to watch the boy. Judge Whitaker cleared his throat, the sound snapping Harper's attention back to the proceedings. "Before we begin," the judge said, adjusting his glasses, "I'd like to acknowledge the presence of Officer Harper and his K-9 partner. They're here today as part of routine courthouse security." The judge's gaze shifted briefly toward the corner, a polite nod acknowledging both man and dog. A few people turned to glance at the German shepherd, whose steady presence seemed to command the room more than the judge's words themselves. Caleb perked up at the mention of the dog, his small body wiggling against his mother's side. He turned to Rachel with wide eyes and whispered, "He's talking about Doggy." Rachel pressed a finger to her lips and gave a small, tight smile. "She, honey," she whispered back. Listen to the judge, but Caleb's excitement was hard to contain. His little feet swung back and forth beneath the bench, his sneakers thudding softly against the wooden seat. Each gentle thump seemed to echo louder than it should in the otherwise still room. From his vantage point, Officer Harper caught the motion and allowed himself a barely visible grin. Children had a way of cutting through tension, though this child in particular had managed to stir something even his seasoned instincts couldn't quite name. Judge Whitaker continued, his voice steady, but his eyes flicking toward the child now, and then as though sensing the quiet disruption. "Today's hearing concerns the custody arrangements of minor Caleb Moore," he announced, scanning the papers before him. Rachel's stomach tightened at the sound of her son's name, but Caleb remained oblivious, still locked in his silent conversation with the K-9. His small shoulders leaned forward as if he could bridge the distance between them with sheer determination. Then it happened, a small but unmistakable shift. Rex's head turned just slightly, his amber eyes narrowing with what could only be described as curiosity. The dog's ears twitched, and for the briefest moment, he inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. Harper felt the faint pull of the leash and tensed. He didn't move, but every muscle in his body braced for action. Was it a scent? A sound? His partner rarely reacted without cause. The judge paused mid-sentence, sensing the shift in attention. "Is everything all right, Officer Harper?" he asked, his tone more curious than concerned. "Yes, Your Honor," Harper replied smoothly, though he kept his eyes on Rex. Just routine vigilance. A ripple of soft murmurs spread through the benches. Several attendees turned to look again at the German Shepherd, whose calm exterior belied an energy that seemed to vibrate just beneath the surface. Rachel felt her pulse quicken. She tightened her grip on Caleb's hand, though the boy showed no fear, only fascination. He giggled quietly, the sound light and musical in the charged atmosphere. "Doggy is looking at me," he whispered, leaning toward his mother. Rachel managed a shaky smile. "Maybe he likes you," she said softly, though inside her thoughts churned. Why was the dog so focused on her child? The judge gave a small nod, satisfied with the officer's response, and resumed the hearing. Papers shuffled, pens scratched against notepads, and the rhythmic cadence of legal dialogue filled the air. But for those who had noticed the exchange, the room felt different, now sharper, more alive, as though some unseen thread connected the child, the dog, and the unfolding morning. As arguments began and witnesses were called, Rex remained an island of stillness in the corner. Yet every so often, when Caleb shifted in his seat or whispered softly to his mother, the German Shepherd's eyes tracked the movement with unwavering precision. Harper stood motionless, but his thoughts refused to settle. Rex was trained to detect more than contraband. He could sense stress, fear, even the faint chemical signals of human emotion. Whatever had captured his attention was no accident. The proceedings marched on, but for Rachel, time felt elastic. Every tick of the courtroom clock stretched like a drawn bowstring. Her ears caught fragments of legal jargon, but her mind kept drifting back to the silent exchange playing out at the edge of the room. Her curious child and the watchful K-9, locked in a wordless dialogue no adult could decipher. No one could know it yet, not the mother clutching her son's hand, not the officer monitoring his partner, not even the judge who prided himself on maintaining order, but this quiet pause, this seemingly harmless fascination between a child and a dog, was the first tremor of a revelation that would soon ripple through the entire courtroom. For nearly half an hour, the courtroom followed its familiar rhythm. Questions asked and answered, legal motions made, and papers shuffled into neat piles. Yet beneath the outward calm, a subtle current of unease pulsed just below the surface. Every so often, eyes flicked toward the corner where the German Shepherd sat, still and statuesque, his focus never straying far from the boy in the second row. Caleb, meanwhile, remained as entranced as ever. His small legs swung back and forth in restless rhythm, the tips of his sneakers tapping the bench like a quiet drumbeat. Every time his mother whispered for him to sit still, he would nod dutifully only to lean forward again seconds later, eyes locked on the K-9 with the kind of unshakable fascination only a child could sustain. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. It began with a faint, almost imperceptible twitch of Rex's ears, followed by a subtle tightening of the muscles along his shoulders. Officer Daniel Harper, ever attuned to his partner's signals, straightened instinctively. His hand tightened around the leather leash, though he gave no verbal command. The dog had decided to move. It was not a sudden lunge or a sharp, alarming motion. Instead, Rex rose with a slow, deliberate grace that drew every pair of eyes in the room. One powerful paw slid forward, claws clicking softly against the polished floor. His head lowered slightly, amber eyes fixed on a single point, the little boy who had been calling to him since the morning began. The sound of claws against wood echoed through the hushed courtroom, each step measured and quiet, but unmistakable. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. The judge's pen froze above his notepad. A clerk stopped typing, her fingers hovering above the keys. For a moment, even the overhead lights seemed to hum louder as the room collectively held its breath. Rachel's heart leapt into her throat. Her arm instinctively tightened around Caleb's small shoulders, pulling him close against her side. "Stay with me," she whispered, her voice trembling despite her effort to remain calm. Caleb, however, showed no fear. His eyes widened with pure delight as he watched the German shepherd advance. "Doggie's coming," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room like a small, bright bell. Officer Harper moved with the dog, his steps slow but sure, keeping the leash at a controlled length. He knew better than to halt Rex mid-action when the dog's instincts were engaged. Years of partnership had taught him to trust the animal's judgment, even when the reason wasn't immediately clear. "Officer Harper?" Judge Whitaker's voice broke the silence, calm but edged with curiosity. "Is there a problem?" "No problem, Your Honor," Harper replied evenly, though his eyes never left Rex. He paused, searching for the right word. "Interested?" The judge raised one silver eyebrow. "Interested?" "Yes, sir," Harper said. "It's not a formal alert, just focus." The explanation did little to settle the room. A ripple of whispers spread across the benches as spectators leaned toward one another, their voices no more than nervous breaths. Even the opposing attorneys, who only moments earlier had been engrossed in legal arguments, now stood silently, their papers forgotten in their hands. Rex continued forward, each step deliberate and soundless except for the faint tap of his claws. He moved with the confidence of a creature certain of its purpose, his gaze unwavering. When he reached the barrier separating the gallery from the main floor, he paused, his head tilted slightly, ears twitching, as if considering his next move. Caleb's face lit up with a grin, so wide it seemed to brighten the room. "Hi, doggy," he whispered, leaning forward until his small hands gripped the edge of the bench. Rachel's grip tightened. "Caleb, stay back," she murmured, though her own voice betrayed a tremor of awe. She had seen police dogs before on the news, at community events, but never this close, never moving with such quiet authority. Harper stopped just behind his partner, his hand firm on the leash, but his body relaxed enough to avoid signaling alarm. "Easy, Rex," he said softly, his voice low and steady. "Easy." The German shepherd flicked one ear in acknowledgement, but did not retreat. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, nose lifting as he inhaled deeply, testing the air around the child and his mother. The audience seemed to inhale with him. Rachel could feel the weight of the entire courtroom pressing down on her. Dozens of strangers watched as a fully trained police, K-9 an animal capable of subduing suspects and detecting dangerous substances, stood mere feet from her 3-year-old son. Her mind raced with questions she could not voice. Why Caleb? Was there something the dog sensed, something invisible to human eyes? Caleb, blissfully unaware of the tension, giggled. "Doggie's sniffing me," he announced proudly, his words earning a few nervous chuckles from the gallery. Harper crouched slightly to bring himself closer to Rex's level, his eyes sharp and analytical. He recognized the signs: deep inhalations, slow tail movement, ears forward but not pinned. It was not an aggressive stance. It was curiosity intense, focused, but not threatening. Still, the officer's mind ticked through possibilities. Was there an unfamiliar scent on the child's clothing? A faint trace of food? Residue from something innocuous, yet intriguing, to a dog trained in detection? The judge cleared his throat softly, breaking the spell. "Officer Harper," he said, his voice carrying the steady authority of the bench, "is there any reason for concern?" Harper rose from his crouch, keeping his eyes on Rex. "Not at this time, Your Honor," he replied. "It's not an alert. Just interest. He may have caught a scent he recognizes." Rachel exhaled a shaky breath, though the knot of anxiety in her chest refused to loosen. Rex gave one final sniff, then sat back on his haunches with the precision of a soldier returning to attention. His amber eyes never left Caleb, but the tension in his body eased, his tail giving a single slow wag. A wave of relieved murmurs swept through the courtroom. Shoulders relaxed. Papers shuffled back into motion. The spell was broken at least on the surface. Caleb clapped his small hands together, his smile triumphant. "Doggy likes me," he declared, his voice ringing with innocent certainty. The judge allowed himself the faintest smile before turning back to the matter at hand. "Very well," he said, tapping his gavel lightly. "Let's continue." But as Harper led Rex back toward their post, the officer's mind remained alert. His partner rarely acted without reason. Something about the boy or something near him had caught the dog's trained attention, and Harper intended to find out what it was. Rachel tried to steady her breathing as the legal proceedings resumed, but her heart refused to calm. She hugged Caleb a little tighter, grateful for the dog's gentleness, yet unsettled by the unspoken question that lingered in the air. The courtroom slowly returned to order, but the quiet electricity of the moment lingered like a low hum beneath the judge's words. The K-9's seemingly simple movement, a few deliberate steps toward a curious child, had shifted the energy of the room in ways no one could yet fully explain. And though the hearing pressed forward, everyone present carried the same silent thought. The dog knew something they didn't. The courtroom settled back into its formal rhythm, but the spell of the moment refused to fully dissolve. Papers rustled and voices resumed their professional cadence. Yet a quiet energy lingered in the air, as if the room itself was still holding its breath. The gavel had struck, the case had resumed, and yet every soul present could feel that something extraordinary had just brushed the edges of an otherwise ordinary hearing. Caleb sat perfectly still now, his small body pressed against his mother's side. The restless swinging of his legs had ceased, replaced by a stillness rare for a child his age. But his eyes, bright, round, and endlessly curious, remained fixed on the German shepherd who had approached him so deliberately. Rex sat once again beside Officer Harper, posture impeccable, chest rising and falling with the slow rhythm of controlled breathing. To an untrained eye, he was the very picture of obedience. Yet Harper knew better. His partner's attention, though outwardly calm, had not drifted back to neutral. Every now and then, the dog's ears flicked forward, and his gaze would return to the little boy seated among the rows of onlookers. Harper adjusted his grip on the leash and gave a quiet command, his voice low enough to blend with the distant clack of the court clerk's keyboard. "Focus, Rex." The German shepherd flicked one ear, but did not shift his gaze. Harper hid a small frown. Rex was listening that there was no doubt, but the dog was making a choice. And that choice, as subtle as it was, unsettled the officer more than he cared to admit. At the bench, Judge Whitaker continued his questioning, his voice steady and deliberate as he guided the attorneys through custody details and visitation schedules. But even he could not resist the occasional glance toward the corner where the K-9 sat. He had presided over hundreds of hearings in his long career, but this silent interplay between a child and a police dog was unlike anything he had encountered in his courtroom. Rachel tried to focus on the legal proceedings, but her heart was not in the words echoing across the chamber. Her attorney leaned in, now and then, to whisper clarifications, but her attention remained locked on the silent exchange happening just a few feet away. She could feel Caleb's small hand curled into hers, warm and reassuring. And yet, the longer she watched the dog's unblinking gaze, the more she felt an inexplicable chill. Why was he still watching her son? Caleb, however, seemed completely at ease. He leaned toward his mother and whispered, "Doggie's my friend." Rachel turned to him, her brows knitting. "What makes you say that?" she asked softly. "He told me," Caleb said matter-of-factly, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. Rachel blinked, startled. "Told you?" "Honey, dogs don't talk." Caleb tilted his head in thought, his small mouth curling into a faint, secretive smile. "Not with words," he replied, his voice barely audible. "With his eyes." Rachel opened her mouth to respond, but the words died on her tongue. There was something unsettlingly certain in her son's tone, something that made her wonder if, in his own innocent way, he might be right. Across the aisle, Harper caught the quiet exchange. Though he could not hear the words, he read the body language, the boy's earnest expression, the mother's subtle unease. He felt a strange pull of curiosity. Rex was trained to detect threats: contraband, explosives, concealed weapons, but he was equally adept at reading emotion. Was he reacting to fear? Anxiety? Or was it something else entirely? Something Harper could neither see nor name. The officer crouched slightly, resting one knee on the floor beside his partner. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. "What are you telling me?" Rex didn't move, didn't whine, didn't bark. Instead, he gave the faintest flick of his tail, a motion so subtle Harper almost missed it. It wasn't an alert. It wasn't even a signal Harper could classify within his years of experience. It was acknowledgement. A quiet moment of recognition passed between dog and handler, a silent understanding that something about this child was different, though not dangerous. Meanwhile, the judge's voice droned on, but the audience's focus continued to wander. Several spectators shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting sideways glances at the boy and the dog. Even the attorneys, typically laser-focused on their cases, seemed distracted, their eyes flicking toward the K-9 every time Caleb stirred. For Rachel, the room felt smaller with every passing minute. Her heart beat a steady rhythm against her ribs, quick and insistent. She wanted to look away, to break the connection between her son and the animal, but something deeper held her in place. Caleb's voice broke the silence between them once more. "He likes me, Mommy," he said, his small fingers squeezing hers. "I can feel it." Rachel swallowed hard. "How do you know?" Caleb leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "Because I like him too." Something in his words, so simple, so pure, sent a shiver through her. She looked back toward the German shepherd and found those amber eyes still watching, calm but unyielding. It was as though the dog was listening, even from across the room. Officer Harper straightened, his mind racing through the possibilities. He trusted Rex more than he trusted most humans. The dog's instincts were rarely wrong. And yet, there was no threat here, no scent of danger, no sign of illicit substances. Just a child, small, innocent, and inexplicably captivating. The officer's radio crackled faintly at his hip, a mundane reminder of the outside world. But even that did little to break the invisible thread stretched between child and dog. Judge Whitaker paused briefly to adjust his glasses, his eyes catching on the silent tableau at the side of the room. He tapped his pen lightly against the bench, his expression thoughtful. Finally, he cleared his throat and addressed the officer. "Officer Harper," the judge said, his tone measured, "your partner seems unusually attentive today. Is there something we should be aware of?" All eyes turned once again to the corner. Harper met the judge's gaze, but kept a steady hand on Rex's harness. "No, Your Honor," he replied calmly. "He's aware, that's all. Sometimes he notices things before we do." The judge raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. He returned to the paperwork before him, though the faint crease in his brow betrayed a lingering curiosity. Rachel exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. She wanted to believe the officer's explanation, but the look in the dog's eyes told her there was more, something wordless and profound that couldn't be explained away by training or instinct. Caleb, still holding his mother's hand, tilted his head slightly and offered a small, knowing smile. "Doggie's my friend," he whispered again, softer this time, as if sharing a secret with the air itself. And as the courtroom carried on around them, voices rising and falling, paper shuffling, decisions being made, one undeniable truth settled like a quiet heartbeat in the room. Whatever had drawn the boy and the K-9 together was beyond the understanding of adults, beyond the realm of law and procedure. It was something deeper, older, and entirely their own, a silent conversation spoken in glances, a connection that neither words nor gavel could interrupt. Even Officer Harper, seasoned and pragmatic, could not look away. He simply stood beside his partner and watched, his heart catching on a truth he could not articulate. Some bonds, he realized, defy explanation. The air inside the courtroom felt heavier now, though no one could quite explain why. The proceedings continued, questions asked, motions made, evidence presented, but the subtle tension created by the earlier encounter lingered like a quiet storm cloud waiting to break. Judge Whitaker's voice carried steadily across the room, outlining the next steps in the custody hearing, but the audience remained distracted. Their ears followed the legal discourse, yet their eyes returned, again and again, to the corner where Officer Harper stood with Rex, the German shepherd whose unwavering attention had shifted the atmosphere from ordinary to charged. Rex's body language was unmistakable to those trained to read it. He was calm, yes, but he was also locked in a state of keen awareness. His amber eyes tracked every movement, every shuffle of papers, every nervous fidget, without so much as a blink of disinterest. Though he no longer stared exclusively at the boy, Caleb, there was a quiet insistence in the way his nose occasionally lifted, inhaling the air as if testing invisible threads that wove through the room. Officer Harper, ever vigilant, felt the change in his partner. Years of working with Rex had taught him to trust the dog's instincts, even when the reason wasn't immediately clear. Harper had seen Rex detect concealed narcotics hidden behind double walls, locate lost children in dense woods, and alert officers to dangers no human could sense. And now, as the German shepherd took another slow, deliberate breath, Harper's own pulse quickened. Something was here. He didn't know what. Harper crouched slightly beside his partner, his hand steady on the leash. "What are you catching, Muddy?" he whispered, his voice pitched low enough that only Rex could hear. "Talk to me." Rex gave no bark, no whine. Instead, his ears flicked forward, his nose twitching in a precise rhythm that Harper recognized instantly. This was no idle curiosity. This was investigation. Across the room, Rachel felt her own unease sharpen. She followed the officer's quiet movements, her heart tightening with each measured inhale of the dog. Caleb, sensing the shift, pressed closer to her side, but remained unafraid. In fact, the boy's eyes sparkled with something Rachel couldn't name: anticipation, maybe, or the calm certainty of someone who understood far more than he should. "Mommy," Caleb whispered, tugging at her sleeve. "Doggy smells something." Rachel froze. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "He's looking for it," Caleb replied with simple confidence. "I can tell." Rachel's breath caught. She searched her son's face for some clue, some sign that he was simply parroting what he saw. But his expression was unshaken, his voice clear. At the bench, Judge Whitaker, noticed the subtle disturbance. He tapped his pen lightly, eyes narrowing as he observed the officer and his K-9. Finally, he set the pen down and addressed the room with calm authority. "Officer Harper," the judge said, his deep voice breaking the soft hum of conversation, "is there an issue?" All eyes turned toward the corner. Harper rose to his full height, his posture respectful but firm. "Your Honor," he began, "my partner is indicating interest in something present in the courtroom. He has not given a full alert, but I believe it would be prudent to investigate further." A ripple of uneasy whispers moved through the gallery. Attorneys exchanged wary glances. Parents clutched their children a little tighter. The clerk hesitated, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. The judge adjusted his glasses, considering. "Is this related to a security concern?" "Potentially," Harper replied carefully. "It may be nothing. But Rex doesn't fixate without reason." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Judge Whitaker gave a single nod. "Proceed with discretion, officer. We will pause until you are satisfied." Harper inclined his head in thanks and turned to his partner. "Search," he commanded softly. The single word transformed Rex. The calm, watchful dog became a precise instrument of detection, moving with purpose, but without aggression. His nose lowered toward the floor as he began a slow, methodical sweep of the gallery. Rachel clutched Caleb's small hand, her heart pounding. She felt every muscle in her body tense as the dog approached their row, though he did not stop. He sniffed carefully at the base of the bench, his movements silent and deliberate, before continuing down the line. Murmurs spread as the German shepherd worked, his handler following closely, eyes sharp and alert. The scent trail seemed to pull Rex toward the back of the room, where a group of spectators sat stiffly, their faces carefully neutral. And then there it was. Rex stopped abruptly beside a middle-aged man seated near the door. The dog's body stiffened, his nose hovering just inches from a worn leather briefcase resting at the man's feet. His tail lowered slightly, his breathing deepened, and his ears locked forward in a perfect triangle of focus. Harper's voice rang out, firm but controlled. "Rex, alert?" The German shepherd sat sharply, posture rigid, gaze fixed on the briefcase. His response was unmistakable, a trained signal indicating the presence of something he was conditioned to find. The room erupted in startled whispers. The man at the center of the attention, a well-dressed individual with graying hair and an expression, carefully schooled into calm, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "This is a mistake," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm here as a witness. That bag contains nothing but documents." "Sir, please remain seated," Harper instructed, his voice even but commanding. "We'll need to check the contents of your bag." Two uniformed bailiffs moved swiftly to assist, their faces set in professional seriousness. Rachel held Caleb close, her breath shallow as she watched the unfolding scene. Beside her, Caleb leaned forward slightly, eyes wide not with fear but with fascination. "Doggy found it," he whispered, as though narrating a story only he could fully understand. The man protested quietly as the bailiffs retrieved the briefcase and set it carefully on a nearby table. Harper approached, donning protective gloves before unzipping the worn leather. The courtroom fell silent, every creak of the zipper amplified by the tension that now thrummed through the air. Inside, beneath a stack of neatly arranged legal papers, lay a small, sealed container. Harper's trained eye recognized the type instantly as scent-proof case, often used to conceal controlled substances. The man's face drained of color. Gasps rippled through the room as Harper carefully removed the container and signaled to the bailiffs. "We'll have this tested immediately," he said, his voice a calm counterpoint to the rising buzz of speculation. Judge Whitaker's expression hardened as he addressed the man. "Sir, you will remain in custody until this matter is clarified." Bailiffs, escort him to a holding area. The man attempted one last weak protest, but the bailiffs were already at his side, guiding him firmly toward the door. As the tension broke into a wave of murmurs and relieved sighs, Harper gave Rex a quiet pat on the shoulder. "Good boy," he murmured, pride and gratitude threading through his voice. Rex's amber eyes flicked briefly toward Caleb, the faintest wag of his tail betraying something softer than mere professionalism. Caleb grinned, his small voice carrying across the room with innocent certainty. "Doggy saved us." Rachel felt a rush of emotion tighten her chest. She tightened her arms around her son, overwhelmed by a flood of gratitude she could not fully articulate. The judge cleared his throat, his voice once again the steady anchor of authority. "Thanks to the attentiveness of Officer Harper and his K-9 partner," he said, "a potential danger has been averted. This court is indebted to their vigilance." The gavel struck, but the echo carried with a different weight now. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal arguments and custody disputes. It had become the stage for an unexpected act of quiet heroism. And through it all, the bond that had sparked the chain of events remained undeniable. As Harper guided Rex back to his post, the dog cast one last, lingering glance toward the small boy who had first pointed at him. In that silent exchange of meeting of eyes across the crowded room, there was something deeper than mere recognition. It was as if the dog and the child shared a secret no one else could touch, a quiet understanding that sometimes innocence sees the truth long before the world is ready to acknowledge it. The courtroom had been tense before, but now the energy was almost electric. A low hum of anxious chatter filled the space as the bailiffs escorted the gray-haired man and his confiscated briefcase out of the chamber. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every echo of their footsteps, seemed to reverberate against the walls with ominous clarity. Caleb sat perched on the bench beside his mother, his wide eyes following the departing officers as though watching the climax of a movie. Rachel held his small hand in a firm, protective grasp, her heart still pounding from the sudden turn of events. Around them, the spectators whispered in hushed tones, leaning toward one another to exchange theories about what might have been hidden inside the sealed container. Officer Harper remained composed, though inside his mind raced with the possibilities. He had handled hundreds of K-9 deployments during his career drug busts, bomb threats, missing persons, but this situation carried a peculiar gravity. The man's unassuming demeanor, the seemingly ordinary setting of a custody hearing, and the precise, unwavering alert from Rex combined into a mystery that set Harper's instincts on edge. Judge Whitaker, ever the embodiment of judicial calm, tapped his gavel lightly to regain order. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his deep voice steadying the restless room, "this court will remain in recess until the contents of the container are properly examined. I ask for your patience as law enforcement does their work." The murmurs faded to a nervous silence. The bailiffs secured the exits, while another officer stepped outside to relay the evidence to a forensic technician waiting in the adjacent security office. Harper remained by the bench, one hand resting on Rex's harness. The German shepherd sat alert and poised, his gaze still sweeping the room as though ensuring no other hidden dangers lurked within the polished wooden walls. Rachel could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She hadn't come here expecting anything more than a tense legal proceeding, but now the air was thick with the kind of suspense usually reserved for late-night crime dramas. She glanced down at Caleb, who was still smiling, calm as ever. "Mommy," he whispered, leaning close so that only she could hear. "Doggy found the bad thing." Rachel tightened her hold on his hand. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Caleb tilted his head, his expression serious for a child barely 3 years old. "He smelled it before anyone else. That's why he came to me. I told you he talks with his eyes." Rachel swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Her son's quiet certainty sent a shiver down her spine. Minutes stretched like hours. The courtroom's usual clockwork pace had given way to an uneasy pause. Spectators shifted in their seats, the sound of fabric rustling against wood, filling the silence like a soft drumbeat. Lawyers whispered to their clients in tones too low to decipher. Even Judge Whitaker, typically composed to the point of stoicism, adjusted his glasses more than once, betraying a flicker of impatience. Finally, the side door opened with a sharp click. A uniformed officer stepped inside, carrying a sealed evidence bag. All eyes followed him as he crossed the room and approached the bench. "Your Honor," the officer said, his voice carrying just enough to be heard by the room. The container was opened and tested by our on-site technician. Inside, we found a small but significant quantity of fentanyl, as well as forged legal documents. Gasps rippled through the gallery like a sudden gust of wind. Rachel's breath caught. She wasn't familiar with every street drug, but she knew enough about fentanyl to understand the danger, a substance so potent that even a trace amount could be lethal. Her mind raced with terrifying scenarios. What if the man had intended to leave it behind? What if a child had touched it? The judge's normally even tone sharpened. "Fentanyl?" "Yes, Your Honor," the officer confirmed grimly. Had it been released or mishandled, it could have endangered everyone present. The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a heavy curtain. Mothers instinctively pulled their children closer. Spectators exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even the attorneys, usually masters of composure, seemed momentarily shaken. Rachel turned to Caleb, her heart tightening. He met her gaze with the same unshaken calm he had shown all morning. "Doggy saved us," he said simply, echoing his earlier words. Officer Harper knelt beside Rex, running a steady hand along the dog's sturdy back. "Good work, partner," he murmured. His voice was soft, but carried a deep resonance of gratitude. Rex responded with a single wag of his tail, amber eyes still sharp and alert. Judge Whitaker straightened in his chair, his commanding presence returning. "Thanks to the swift action of Officer Harper and his K-9 partner," he said, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom, "a grave threat has been neutralized before it could cause harm. Let the record show the critical importance of their vigilance." The gavel struck with a sharp crack, but this time it carried the weight of relief rather than mere procedure. Across the room, spectators began to exhale, some murmuring quiet prayers of thanks. A mother clutched her teenage son in a spontaneous hug. A pair of elderly witnesses exchanged tearful smiles, shaken by how close danger had come to what should have been a routine day. Rachel felt her own eyes sting as she looked down at Caleb. She tightened her arms around him, overcome by gratitude. "You're safe," she whispered into his hair. "Thanks to that brave dog, you're safe." Caleb smiled, his voice barely more than a breath. "I knew he'd protect us." Harper approached the mother and child, offering a reassuring nod. "You've got a brave little guy here," he said kindly. He noticed Rex before any of us understood what was happening. Sometimes kids pick up on things adults miss. Rachel managed a small, grateful smile. "He's always been observant," she admitted, though her voice wavered. Harper crouched slightly, addressing Caleb directly. "You've got a good eye, buddy." "Rex thinks so too." Caleb giggled, leaning forward to meet the dog's steady gaze. "I told Mommy he talks with his eyes," he said matter-of-factly. Harper chuckled softly, exchanging a knowing glance with his partner. "You're not wrong about that." Rex leaned forward just enough to allow Caleb a gentle touch on his thick fur. The boy's small hand rested against the dog's neck, and for a fleeting moment, the courtroom once tense with fear felt calm, united by a quiet moment of connection between innocence and instinct. As Harper led Rex back toward their post, Rachel found herself reflecting on the chain of events. A single, innocent gesture, her son pointing excitedly at a dog, had triggered a discovery that might have saved countless lives. The thought sent another wave of shivers down her spine. Judge Whitaker called the court back to order, but even as the custody hearing resumed, the air remained charged with a sense of quiet awe. The paperwork and legal arguments now felt strangely small compared to what had just unfolded. Every person present understood, whether they admitted it aloud or not, they had all been inches from danger, spared only by the instincts of a trained K-9 and the pure-hearted curiosity of a 3-year-old boy. Rachel squeezed Caleb's hand once more, silently thanking the dog whose steady amber eyes had seen what no one else could. And as the legal proceedings resumed their careful rhythm, she knew she would never forget the moment when an ordinary day in court turned into an extraordinary story of instinct, courage, and a bond that defied explanation. Even after the courtroom returned to its usual rhythm, the energy inside the chamber felt undeniably changed. Papers were shuffled, lawyers conferred with their clients, and Judge Whitaker resumed the custody hearing, but no one present could shake the memory of what had just transpired. Every glance toward the corner where the K-9 sat seemed to carry an undercurrent of awe and gratitude. What had begun as an ordinary legal proceeding had transformed into something unforgettable, vivid reminder of how fragile safety can be and how quickly a quiet day can tilt toward danger. Rex, the German shepherd whose silent instincts had saved the day, lay calmly at Officer Harper's feet now, his posture relaxed but still vigilant. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like any other well-trained police dog resting between duties. Yet to those who had witnessed the tense sequence of events, his very presence carried a new weight. This was no mere animal. This was a partner, a protector, a silent sentinel whose senses had pierced a threat no human could have detected. Harper knelt briefly to check Rex's harness and offer a quiet word of praise. "You did good today, buddy," he murmured, his voice carrying only to the dog. "Real good," Rex responded with a single wag of his tail and a slow blink, the subtle signs of contentment that only his handler would recognize. For Harper, moments like this reaffirmed every long hour of training and every sleepless night spent on call. His partner had once again proven that instinct and preparation could mean the difference between calm and catastrophe. Across the gallery, Rachel sat with Caleb nestled safely in her lap. Though the hearing had resumed, she found it nearly impossible to focus on the legal dialogue unfolding around her. Her mind replayed the last hour like a looping film. Caleb's excited point toward the dog, the slow and deliberate approach of the K-9, the sudden search, and the discovery of a substance deadly enough to endanger every person in the room. She felt the weight of what could have been, 100 invisible dangers averted, because a child noticed what adults ignored. Caleb, in contrast, remained blissfully untroubled. His bright eyes followed Rex with unyielding fascination, a small smile curving his lips every time the dog flicked an ear or shifted his gaze. He leaned close to his mother and whispered, "Doggy is my hero." Rachel hugged him tighter, her throat tightening around unspoken words. "Yes," she managed softly. "He really is." The hearing itself now seemed almost trivial in comparison to the drama that had unfolded. Attorneys presented their closing statements with professional focus, but their voices carried a subtle tremor, as though even the practiced cadence of legal argument could not fully mask the lingering shock. Judge Whitaker, normally a pillar of composed authority, spoke with an added layer of solemnity, his eyes flicking now and then toward the K-9 team that had turned an ordinary session into a life-saving intervention. At one point, the judge paused to acknowledge the incident formally. "Before we proceed further," he said, his deep voice echoing through the chamber, "I wish to commend Officer Harper and his K-9 partner Rex for their extraordinary service today. Their vigilance has undoubtedly prevented harm, and this court expresses its deepest gratitude. Let the record reflect not only their professionalism, but their heroism. Courtroom erupted in a soft but sincere round of applause. The sound was tentative at first, polite claps echoing through the high-ceilinged chamber, but quickly grew into something warm and heartfelt. Harper gave a modest nod, his hand resting gently on Rex's back. The dog remained stoic, his gaze steady, though his tail thumped once against the floor in quiet acknowledgement. Caleb clapped enthusiastically, his small hands creating sharp, joyful bursts of sound. "Good job, doggy," he called out with the innocent confidence only a toddler could possess. His voice rang across the room, earning a ripple of affectionate laughter from the gallery. Rachel smiled through the sting of unexpected tears. She brushed a strand of hair from Caleb's forehead and whispered, "You were part of this too, sweetheart." "You noticed him first." Caleb turned to her, eyes shining. "Because he talked to me," he said with perfect certainty. "He told me he needed help." Rachel felt a shiver of something she could neither name nor deny. She knew her son meant the words literally children his age often did, but there was a quiet conviction in his tone that stirred something deeper. Perhaps, she thought, there are forms of communication adults have long forgotten how to hear. As the hearing finally drew to a close, the courtroom began to empty. Attorneys gathered their papers, families shuffled toward the exit, and the murmured conversations of relieved spectators filled the air like a gentle tide. Officer Harper remained near the bench, exchanging a few quiet words with the bailiffs about the next steps in the investigation. Rachel hesitated as she rose from her seat. Caleb balanced on her hip. Something in her heart compelled her to cross the room before leaving. "Officer Harper?" she said softly as she approached. Harper turned, his expression warm despite the exhaustion lining his face. "Ma'am, I just wanted to thank you," Rachel said, her voice trembling despite her effort to keep it steady, "for what you and Rex did today. I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. Harper gave a reassuring nod. "You don't need to thank me. Rex was just doing his job. And your little guy?" He glanced down at Caleb with a small smile. "He's got a gift for noticing things. Not every adult would have paid attention to a police dog the way he did." Caleb beamed, clearly delighted to be included in the conversation. "Doggy likes me," he announced proudly. Harper chuckled, crouching slightly to meet the boy's eyes. "I think you're right," he said. "You and Rex make a pretty good team." Rex, as if understanding the exchange, leaned forward just enough for Caleb to rest a tiny hand on his broad head. The dog's eyes softened, and for a moment the bustling courtroom seemed to fade into silence. It was a quiet, wordless connection, child and K-9, innocence and instinct bound together by a shared experience few could fully comprehend. Rachel felt a lump rise in her throat as she watched the gentle interaction. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time to the dog as much as to the officer. Harper rose and offered a polite nod. "Take care of each other," he said simply. As Rachel carried Caleb toward the exit, the weight of the day began to settle into her bones. The legal outcome of the hearing no longer felt like the defining event of the morning. Instead, what lingered was the memory of a 3-year-old boy pointing across a courtroom, the sound of a dog's claws clicking against polished wood, and the heart-stopping realization that danger had been closer than anyone had imagined. Outside, the late afternoon sunlight bathed the courthouse steps in a warm golden glow. Rachel paused for a moment, letting the breeze wash over her as Caleb rested his head against her shoulder. She looked back through the glass doors just in time to see Rex and Officer Harper disappearing down a hallway, their silhouettes framed by the fading light. Caleb stirred and whispered drowsily, "Bye, doggy." Rachel kissed the top of his head, her heart swelling with gratitude and a strange, quiet wonder. "Bye, hero," she murmured back, her voice barely louder than the rustling leaves. As they stepped into the brightness of the day, Rachel knew this moment would live with her forever, not just as a story to tell, but as a reminder of the invisible safeguards that sometimes appear in the most unexpected forms. A child's innocent curiosity, a dog's keen instincts, and the fragile, miraculous thread of connection that can change everything in the space of a heartbeat. The world moved on around them, cars passing, birds calling, life resuming its usual rhythm, but for Rachel, Caleb, and every soul who had shared that courtroom, the memory of the K-9 who saved them would remain a quiet, enduring testament to the extraordinary power of vigilance and trust.